Hi, everybody. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me. It's Carl talking some more about legal technology. And today, delighted to have Graham Moore of Katchr, the managing director and founder, with me this afternoon. Graham, it's great to see you, and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, really pleased to be here and good to be talking with you.
Fantastic. Um, I'm going to start with a quote I always use with data because I suppose in my younger years, I was, I want to say famous, infamous, maybe better, but I used to have this obsession with data. And Deming's quote always stuck with me, and I still trot it out regularly because it makes me feel a bit cleverer than I actually am. But without data, you're just another person with an opinion. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it's a quote that I like as well, and yeah, I do agree with it. But I think with a caveat. And the thing about data is that data without trust or context is really just potentially just noise. And data in itself does very little, and unless you can add those two key elements, trust and context. And I think that's what people often forget. You can be completely overwhelmed with data itself, and it's not really just about raw data. It's what you do with that data, how you interpret it. So that's the way I like to think about it.
It's an interesting thing for me because that's come up before in the last couple of months when I've been speaking to people. This view that somehow we've become almost subjected to too much data. So much of it is now noise that actually it's very difficult to see the wood for the trees. So I love your idea of context and trust, and I know trust is a big thing for your product line. It'd be useful for, I think, for viewers if you could give a bit of a history of yourself, uh, just introduce yourself that way.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a veteran, I think, these days of the legal tech scene. I started back in 1990 working in practice management, and I've not really managed to escape the sector since. I think, like quite a few of us, once you get embedded in this world, yeah, it's a place you can add a lot of value, and it's sometimes difficult to escape from. So, yeah, I've spent over 30 years now working, helping law firms with getting better value from their data. And in the early days, as I said, it was about practice management systems. But for the last 15 or so years, it's very much been around the Katchr business that I set up back in 2011. Um, I think for a long time, my focus has been on performance, accountability, and decision making. It's as we were just saying, it's about what you can do with data rather than just data for its own sake. And I think what I've seen over the years, it's really frustrating working with law firms that you see really smart people who are forced to make big decisions sometimes with partial data, conflicting data, or data that they just don't trust. So that's what we try to do as an organisation, as a business Katchr. We're not just a reporting or a dashboard company. We're a decision infrastructure company for law firms.
It's an interesting differentiation you made there in terms of just being able to provide data to people and actually perhaps giving them some extra context and a bit more impetus to make better decisions as well. Because for decades, people have always said, "Well, we haven't got enough data." But I think over the years, that's ceased to be the case. There's probably, if anything, too much, as we discussed. So no, it's interesting to see that kind of differentiation there between just providing the data and actually making it more of an aid to decision making rather than here you are, make your own decision from that. Um, I read some of your website in advance of this and was taken by how much I aligned with some of the things you mention on there. I think the problems of disparate data sources, scattered information, the sort of out of date data. By the time it reaches anybody, it's now out of date. or the fact that, there are inconsistent places where this thing can be found. And so all of those kind of resonated with me. But I guess, do they resonate with users as well? Do clients feel that now? They truly feel it?
I think the interesting thing for us is that once you explain that, they do absolutely resonate with it. I think there is still often the perception that the problem is just that they don't have or they can't access the data. It's buried away somewhere. But actually, the problem is more complex than people actually regularly appreciate. But once you start talking through those themes, then that's when you start to see the heads nodding in the room, when people do actually recognize those things. And, back to what you said about the volume of data, these days, data is pretty much exponential in terms of its growth. And yeah, absolutely no organization has too little data these days. It is almost always the case that firms actually have too much data to make sense of, and it's a case of how that data is curated and how it's then used to actually make it useful. And the more systems, and we see over time, law firms have more and more systems that they use for different aspects of running themselves as a business. And the more different systems you have, the more different versions, more different interpretations you can have of essentially the same data item. An employee of your firm, or a case that the lawyers are working on, will be represented in multiple places. Same with the clients, the individuals that you're working with, the businesses that you're working with. And if they're represented in multiple different systems, then somehow to get useful information, you've got to combine those multiple systems. And that's where the complexity starts. But then once you start doing that, very often that's when problems start to occur, when people start to then mistrust the data, because what's the actual single version of the truth, and the reality is, there is never one single version of any information in a law firm. But in order to make useful decisions, in order to make use of it, you've got to define what that version is that you're going to use, how you're going to interpret the data, the choice that you're going to make. And just helping law firms to go through that process is a big part of the value, I think, that we add.
The phrase "trusted version of the truth" was something I picked from your website, and I know a single version of the truth has been a mantra about data for as long as data's existed, I suspect. But that trusted version actually, again, is a bit of a differentiation. And so, what do you actually mean by that trusted version of the truth?
Yeah, it comes down to, we have a concept that we always talk about of business rules. So this is the logic that's used to actually decide how to interpret data. And it can be as simple as a formula that's used to calculate a particular measure. Utilization, realization as financial measures are defined differently in different law firms. But it can be much more than that. It can be down to how you attribute the time recording or the billing to a particular individual. And most of the time that's straightforward until that individual changes team, changes department, works temporarily across two departments. That individual might be a trainee and works in multiple departments in the year. How you interpret all those things is really key to making the data useful. And none of that is about the data itself. It's about what we call the business rules that need to be combined with that data in order to make it usable. And once you define those business rules, it's really important that, first of all, everybody in the firm understands them, that they're completely transparent, and that everybody uses those same rules when they interpret the data. Otherwise, you get the classic scenario: the three people arrive at a meeting to discuss a problem. Each of the three people has run their own report to get the important data behind that decision, and they've all got reports showing completely different conclusions because they've interpreted that data differently. And none of those is wrong, but somebody has to make that decision about what that version of truth is, and it needs to be agreed. It needs to be trusted by everyone across the organisation. Otherwise, you're never going to be in a position to be able to make decisions.
I guess my question, having spent sometimes with law firms myself, is how easy is it to get them to agree what that business rule or business rules are?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and yeah, because you've worked for a long time with law firms, you will appreciate that it's not easy. But that is a big part of the value that we bring. We've done this with over 100 law firms across the UK, and we know the questions to ask. We know the process that's needed. We know the patience that's needed on our part sometimes, whilst firms make these decisions, because it can sometimes be controversial. It might be that two partners want to do things differently, but we're always very firm, but in the idea that you have to make that decision, otherwise you can't move forward and get best value from the data. It's not that you can't define two different ways of interpreting a set of numbers. Absolutely, you can. You can look at profitability from a firm-wide perspective, and you can look at profitability from a case-by-case, on a case-by-case basis. And when you do that, you may well interpret the data slightly differently because what you're trying to do is different. But the reasoning behind that, the business rules behind that, need to be explicit. They need to be clearly understood by everybody. And once you've got that clarity, that transparency, then you can move forward.
It's interesting. I did some work with a hospital years ago, who were hugely into health informatics, and their view had always been that for them there was a hierarchy of data, as you suggested there. If you're looking at overall performance, it's very different to individual performance and how it's interpreted. They always said that the best people in their organizations were the ones that would use the data most often. Now, of course, for me, that was gold because we were working with them on some some performance data. So yes, they were all kind of pushing at an open door. But I'm always interested to see that, having established those rules and gotten that agreement with everybody in a firm to say this is how they're going to be interpreted in these circumstances. How does that help them make decisions then? I mean, I think this is more anecdotal than anything else, but, have you seen that changing decision making, having got that far down the road?
Yeah, I think the most significant thing that we see, certainly most frequently, is the confidence. It's the people that actually start to trust the numbers in order to be able to use them for decision making. It's very easy. We all know. We all know lawyers, the way their brains work. They're incredibly analytical. They're trained to question everything, and they do question everything. That is their fundamental legal training, and they do exactly the same when it comes to the operation of the firm. So if numbers are presented in a way that can't be fully backed up without that transparency, then they will always be questioned. And when they're questioned, the conclusions drawn from that then won't necessarily be trusted. And I think what we hear back time and again from our customers is that once the Katchr system is in, everybody is suddenly working from this one set of information that has been curated, it's been agreed, and you've got that alignment, and that almost inevitably leads to better performance because the clarity is there. So that's the most commonly reported benefit, I think. It's that trust in one set of information.
It must be very gratifying to hear that back from clients once they've gone down the road of implementation and they're starting to use it in anger. To get that sort of feedback must be very gratifying to know that they're actually now using it, not just to stare at pictures and that might signify numbers, but actually now using it to make decisions in the way they not just run the business, but lower down how they run cases, for example, and things like that. I can see that, and that probably explains your 30 years plus in the business. In that I can imagine the gratification coming from that.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
know.
exactly.
Sorry, no. Do expand on that, because I'm fascinated to understand. I don't want to say the legal mind, but how lawyers actually do use this data.
Yeah, it's been an interesting learning journey over the years as to how to help law firms with this. As I said, I started out in practice management, and as a practice management vendor, it was always really frustrating that we would produce systems with extensive reporting capabilities, standard reports, report builders, various tools for dynamic reporting. Whatever we did, it was always really difficult to get law firms to adopt them, and we always got pretty negative feedback around that, and that continues to this day. Many of the conversations we have with law firms start with the reporting in our practice management system just isn't good enough. And and I don't actually accept that. It's not that there's a problem with the reporting. It's back to this underlying premise that it's not just about outputting data. Reporting is the first stage in facilitating decision making, and beyond that, you've got to do this interpretation. And the vast majority of law firms are still doing that interpretation with a manual set of spreadsheets. They will run reports out of their line of business systems, their practice management systems, case management, the CRM. But then the data will end up in a spreadsheet, which is usually a huge, complicated mesh of interrelated sheets. And some smart person will have combined this with a set of essentially business rules that have been embedded in the spreadsheet, and that's what the firm runs on. And there's huge problems and risks with that approach. First of all, it's incredibly time consuming. Somebody has to spend time doing that. We often hear about firms where the reporting just happens once a month, so you can only make decisions once a month because you've only got your reporting once a month, and it takes 2 to 3 days at the end of the month to actually compile all these spreadsheets. There's a huge risk. There's an operating risk. The person that designed that spreadsheet, the chances are when that person leaves, and everybody leaves the business eventually, when that person leaves, that spreadsheet will be abandoned because nobody else will be able to manage it. And the next person will come in and they'll build their own similar but different spreadsheet. So there's massive challenges around the way that firms work around that area.
It's interesting. You mentioned the word interpretation there. I'll agree with you about the spreadsheet. Nobody likes picking somebody else's spreadsheet up ever. Nobody's ever wanted to do that as a career. Oh, please, no, do give me something that somebody else has created that I, is going to spend weeks trying to find out. But you mentioned the word interpretation there. Do we have to teach people how to interpret data?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting area for us at the moment. Traditionally, in all forms of business, interpretation of data has been the preserve of analysts. In law firms, it's tended to be the finance team. And one of the things that we really believe is that in most law firms, the finance teams are actually spending their time on too low value work. If you've got people with the skills to actually understand the numbers, to interpret them, to actually draw conclusions from this information, then it's not particularly good use of their time to be exporting data from reports and then putting it into spreadsheets. Those people are much better off actually having communications with the fee-earning team, with the appropriate managers, to actually implement the findings, to actually pass that on to do that communication piece. So I think there's a real opportunity for a much more effective financial function and other business functions within law firms if that interpretation is done by better skilled people rather than the number crunching. But moving forward, and this is a huge opportunity that we see, that dreaded term AI, this is one of the things that AI is really going to be good at. And taking large sets of data and drawing conclusions from it is something that systems will be able to do at least as well as, and I think pretty soon better than humans in most cases. So for a long time, I thought yes, there is an opportunity for more education um, of the lawyers in law firms to understand what's going on. I think actually that's changing now, and I think the systems are going to provide that, and good systems are actually going to help essentially the end users understand much better what's going on without them needing those analytical skills.
That's a fascinating point of view, actually, in terms of 2-3 years ago, maybe before the AI introduction. The idea that actually people probably did need teaching how to interpret the data they were reading, and now thinking that AI may be able to do that. I can see the logic in that. I'd love to see that in operation in terms of that shortcutting process. That'll be very interesting to see. You mentioned the lawyers earlier. One of the things I always remember is being quizzed. I want to say ad nauseum. It may not have been as long as that, but it felt like it in terms of security. Can we make sure that the right people are seeing the right data at the right times, and the ones that shouldn't see it will never see it? How do you manage that through Katchr?
Yeah, so I mean, security is a layer, a layered approach, really. At the base level, all our systems are hosted in the UK with Microsoft Azure, so the base level security is really sound. But built on top of that, in terms of who can see what, yeah, we operate essentially role based security, where the default is the lowest level of access. So every individual who has access to Katchr can only see his or her information by default, and everything else has to be granted above that. We have a whole suite of security tooling that's sort of built around the structure of a law firm. So one of the benefits I think that we and our product has over, if you like, generic reporting BI tools is that it is built around the knowledge of a law firm. We only sell to law firms. Our tools are entirely built for law firms. So pretty much out of the box, the system understands the typical hierarchy of a law firm and what the typical permission options are. So it's very simple to maintain, but it's totally granular as well, and it can be managed. So each individual will only see the data that they're granted access to. By default, they see nothing other than the base level information relating to their own performance. So that's the way we've always approached it, and just by understanding those roles within law firms, we find that works really well.
And I can imagine that's a huge comfort to both IT managers and also senior partners, because they know the risks of that data, the wrong data being viewed by somebody else. So no, that's interesting to hear. You talked about the disparate systems. What kind of systems do you take data from? Not just spreadsheets, but what else?
Yeah, so the starting point for pretty much all of our projects is the firm's main practice management system. And that will typically have all of their finance information in it, all the information about the clients and the matters and the fee earners working on those cases. So we integrate with, I think these days we're up to 22, 23 different practice management systems, and that's always the core. We come across scenarios where firms are running multiple practice management systems, usually as a result of a merger or multiple mergers. That's a real sweet spot for us because we're able to combine that data from those multiple systems. So from a reporting perspective, it just looks like one repository for reporting. But then in addition to that, we will take data from case management systems, so the sort of workflow associated data, onboarding systems, and CRM systems. So any information relating to customer relationships, client relationships, all of that can be combined into the same solution so that, again, from an output perspective, it's completely seamless. All of the joining up is done behind the scenes. That's part of the expertise that we bring to the project, knowing how to extract the data from the systems, but then how to combine it. And then as I was talking about before, building the business rules on top that determine actually how that wiring together happens and how the data is then interpreted. So yeah, a key part of the expertise that we bring to every project is how we get the data in and how we combine it from multiple systems.
That's a great story to hear. And again, I can imagine just loads of nods as you explain that to law firms as well. I'm hugely impressed by the number of integrations with PMS you have. Um, I
It's
think
taken a
part
while.
of the
It's taken a while to build that.
I bet it has. I think part of the thing of working in legal I've found is sometimes there isn't the cooperation you'd like to have had in the past. I'm hoping that has changed. I think it has to a large extent. But I suppose my question is what's in it for the PMS provider at that stage to work with you to help this happen?
Yeah, the level of cooperation varies. Historically, a lot of the systems we worked with were the SQL databases, and and the vendor cooperation wasn't that important. We've got some really skilled engineers who can pretty much take data from anywhere. These days, a lot of systems are cloud based, they're API based, and the vendor sort of collaboration does vary. It's better with some than others. What's in it for them? For those that really understand what's going on, for those that really get the game, what's in it for them is having a partner that can actually satisfy what their customers need. Because despite what they will say, and I don't say this with any malice, because we've got great relationships with a lot of practice management vendors, but they're not able to provide on the management information, the business intelligence side. They're not able to provide what their customers want. Whatever their salespeople might like to be able to say. We've got dashboards, we've got reports. Yes, you have, but you're not specialising in this whole service suite around that. You're not able to provide the level of information that a system like Katchr can, and the proof of that is in the fact that every mid-market practice management system in use in this country, we have at least one law firm that is using that and has decided that they need Katchr on top of it to provide the level of information that they need. And so, for the enlightened practice management vendors, they actually realise that they need a partner like ourselves to make sure that their customers actually get what they want. Otherwise, they're going to spend a lot of time defending essentially disgruntled customers who haven't got the level of reporting, or who are finding they're having to build things themselves when they thought they were buying it as part of their original solution. So yeah, we have some great relationships with some vendors who really do get that, and that works really well both ways.
I think as well, the idea now that data has become such a specialized science of its own right, that having people who do know that is actually an advantage to vendors. They may not like to admit that in some cases, but actually having experts doing the data makes it much easier, one, to keep their system live in a particular place as much as anything else. People exploiting what's in there that's been collected by just daily use of a system and taking advantage of it is a huge bonus, and leaves you with the ability to just concentrate on what you do. In their case, the PMS.
And the thing that I always say is, I was in their shoes once upon a time, and I spent many years trying to solve this problem from inside a PMS vendor, and ultimately realised that it really wasn't possible. You really need to specialise, and no PMS vendor really wants to set up a team the size and with the expertise that we've got, because they've got so many other things to focus on, and so many other things that for them, particularly today, are much higher priority. So it's much easier to allow us to just backfill that specific requirement.
I think another phrase I saw on the website was lawyers being change averse. Now, we smile. I don't think they're alone in this. I think many businesses are change averse, but lawyers particularly are change averse. But the one thing that changes that aversion, I think, is they get something from it, that change. And so, what are the benefits Let's start with the people who work at the firm. What do the people who work at the firm get out of taking Katchr?
Yeah. So I think in terms of the finance team, which is often our sort of our first engagement, the first thing they get is less wrangling of spreadsheets, less time spent actually just manipulating numbers and data, and giving them more time to actually do useful things with that once it's out there. I think in terms of the lawyers, what they immediately get is very clean, clear, easy access to the core information that they want. And the vast majority of lawyers in the vast majority of law firms really just want to be getting on with delivering legal services to their clients. They don't really want to be worrying about the business of law. They don't want to be worrying about how much time they're recording and the value of bills and the value of debtors that their clients are accumulating. They don't really want to have to spend any time on that. But the firm wants them to, the firm needs them to, because ultimately the firm is a business. And therefore, if we can communicate that side of their role really quickly, clearly, and easily to them, then that just reduces the strain on the lawyers. It enables them to spend more time focusing on what's important to them and what's important to their clients. So yeah, I think they're probably the two key stakeholders. I suppose that then there's also the leadership team. So from a leadership perspective, I think the key thing that Katchr brings is consistency and clarity around messaging. So once the firm has decided these are the metrics that we're going to run this firm by, whatever they might be. We could talk forever about what the ideal metrics are for a law firm, but whatever they agree that they're going to be, Katchr provides really consistent and clear communication of that to support the management in actually achieving whatever the objectives are that those metrics are driving towards. And that's, it's almost business 101. You set your objectives, you decide what your metrics are, and then you monitor your metrics. But that, on a day-to-day basis is actually really difficult unless you've got a system that's supporting that. And that's exactly what Katchr does.
And I guess as a sort of follow on to that is that you said there, you could have a big debate about what the best metrics are going to be for managing a firm. But my guess is that those metrics vary enormously from firm to firm, and yet you're able to satisfy that variation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they do vary widely, and they should vary widely because, as I just said, metrics should always be derived, sorry, from your objectives. And every law firm doesn't have, at any point in time, doesn't have exactly the same objectives. So those metrics are going to vary. The advantage again that we have within Katchr is that every implementation of our solution is tailored to that particular firm. We've built a product that's essentially a toolkit that enables metrics to be defined very quickly, very easily, based on whatever the underlying data is. So whilst the day one install of every Katchr system has the same, I don't know what it is, 10, 12 metrics on the home screen, no customer ever goes live with those. Every firm defines their own metrics with us. We implement those, and they get exactly what it is they need to run their business.
Do many firms actually use the information they collect for their clients, whether that be, I guess, transactional users or for the more work provider type client? Is that an increasing trend now that becomes part of the offering?
I think from the law firm's perspective, I wouldn't say it's an increasing trend. I think there's always been a demand from certain types of client for information to be shared. It's an area that we sometimes support our customers with. It's not a key area for us. There's an awful lot of products out there that do this sort of client portal communication piece, and we try not to overlap with that. But from experience, I would say it's been a requirement for a long time for a lot of law firm clients to actually get better access to data. It's tended to be fulfilled again in a very much a manual process. There's a lot of firms that we've worked with over the years who've had a regular process of sending spreadsheets or some sort of pre-packed report to their customers on a weekly or monthly basis. To be honest, they actually quite like usually to manually create those. I wouldn't say that they're manipulating the data, but they do definitely like to see it before it actually goes out direct to their customer. So yeah, it's something that's always there. It's not a key. It's not a key focus for Katchr, certainly at the moment.
Interesting. They want to eyeball it first. Yeah, nobody likes that phone call that comes in afterwards and saying, "I've just been looking at row 25 of this, and it says." So now I can imagine that everybody does want to eyeball it before it goes out the door.
Yeah.
In terms of use cases that it'd be fascinating for me to see the types of things people do use it for inside a firm. We talked about the variety of the metrics. I just wondered if you could share some of those.
Yeah, sure. I think the first one, the obvious one, is performance management. In most firms, the lawyers, the individual fee earners will have targets, will have expectations, whether they're financial targets or not, in terms of the amount of work they deliver and the revenue they bring in or the margin that they bring in on that work. And Katchr out of the box really supports that. It was the first use case that we addressed when we first started the business. Working in collaboration with a law firm that I'd worked with for a long time. So performance management is probably the number one. But then beyond that, there's a lot of other use cases that we've developed over the years. Identifying white space in terms of services across clients is a really key one, I think, these days. The data is always there within law firms. It's always possible to dump out the data on all of your clients and look at for example, your commercial clients. How many of those are we doing all of our 5, 6, whatever it is, services, and how many of those have we got white space for? That's something that the Katchr solution does a really strong job on. And pricing and profitability is another key use case. I think it's probably fair to say that in terms of the business of law, pricing and profitability is the number one concern these days. It's become much higher profile, I think, over the last few years. Obviously, changes in pricing models have put a lot more pressure, if you like, on reviewing the profitability. It used to be that in a law firm, if you were purely doing all of your work on a billable hour basis, then as long as you got your rates set up right and the usual 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 rule that everybody talked about, then you didn't have to worry too much about profitability. As long as everybody was busy and working, the firm was by default profitable. That's no longer the case. With various alternative billing schemes that firms are using, the profitability isn't built in automatically. And given that, it's now really important that firms understand that profitability. And that's something that Katchr absolutely facilitates, understanding that profitability at different levels of granularity, whether it be down to the matter level, whether it's looking at individuals and the cases that they work on, whether it's particular types of work. All of that can be analysed and monitored. I think strategic planning is another thing. Actually understanding what you've achieved in the last year, in the last 3 years, and facilitating the conversations around where you want to go, where the strengths are, where the weaknesses in the firm. The sort of breadth of information that you get is another really important use case. And often have conversations with heads of finance, FDs in law firms, who tell me that they spend an awful lot of their time in Katchr actually looking and analysing the data so they can actually understand what's going on within the firm. And that's what the solution is there for.
I guess falls back to what you were saying earlier, giving them time to rather than involving themselves in the nitty-gritty of swapping spreadsheet data between spreadsheets, etc., it's actually taking that output, however it arrives, and thinking, okay, well, this over here needs my attention. This over here needs somebody else's attention.
Yeah.
They're good. I imagine they're really good stories to tell within a firm as well. You talked earlier in terms of a typical Katchr project, I suppose, in terms of day one, but I'd be fascinated to know what does a Katchr project look like typically. I'm sure there are variations, but typically, how does it go?
Yeah, so a typical implementation starts obviously with engagement. We'll agree a broad scope of a solution that a firm wants, but the work really starts then once the engagement has started, and we will install a vanilla implementation of Katchr. So the firm gets a data warehouse, gets a suite of our standard dashboards, and then we start the real work, which is the conversation around what the firm wants, what the firm needs, how they currently report, the metrics they currently use, the business rules that they currently use behind those metrics, whether they know they use them or not, and we build up a picture of what the information is that the firm needs. We then go into build phase, where we will go through an iterative build of constructing the metrics that they want, of providing them for validation, and then we'll go into a pilot implementation. So we always encourage every one of our customers, before they roll the solution out to the entire firm, that they identify some key stakeholders from all areas of the firm to actually validate the project team's assumptions about what the firm needed, because they're not necessarily always completely reflected in what the end users need. And then eventually we get to the sort of go live rollout. And that, I always like to say, that's not the end, that's the start. It's not an install and disappear project that we do. That is what we like to call the point of first value. We will get you as quickly as possible to the point where you're really getting value from this solution. But that's just a starting point for the long-term relationship then. We have a customer success program that's really designed to make sure that the Katchr solution remains relevant to the firm as the firm develops. And good law firms, good businesses of any type, will change over time, and those timescales are probably getting faster and faster. So what's important today might not still be important in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months' time. So we make sure we've got regular ongoing engagement. We support firms in changing the metrics that they're looking at, the visualizations that they're using, the way they're interpreting the data, and that support can come in two very different forms. It can be that we continue to do that work for the firm as a service, or it could be that we train up their people in being able to do that themselves with our toolkit, and we're completely happy either way the firm chooses to do that, whatever works for them, whatever fits with their business model. So it's all about get to first value as quickly as possible. Ideally, that's around 3 months, and then from that point on, really supporting our customer through the lifetime of their use of the Katchr system.
And presumably that's judging by the number of case studies on your website, that's a long-term lifetime as well, in terms of the life cycle for it. Yeah. What's next for the solution? What's next for Katchr? You said it's been 10 years or so. What's next for it?
Yes. So our movement today is really from reporting towards intelligence. And I talked earlier about the potential for AI in actually deriving the insights, almost replacing that analyst or supporting the analyst, certainly, in making better decisions. So Katchr's really repositioning as a central intelligence platform. It's really providing that platform where all the data is consolidated, brought into one place with the business rules, with all that interpretation layer there, to provide a platform for tools that sit on top of that. And some of those tools, for the foreseeable future, will probably still be visualizations, but more and more over the coming years, those tools are going to be AI-based tools, and they're going to be providing that layer of intelligence. So we're going to be looking at providing automatic insights. We're going to be looking at providing forecasting, actually much more intelligent forecasting rather than sort of the statistical based approach that is all people have been able to do in the past. And also natural language interfaces. So, it's not going to be necessary in the future to navigate to a particular dashboard to find a particular piece of information or see a visualization of some data. That will be driven through natural languages. All of those things are coming in the Katchr centralized intelligence platform. And really, we see this as a foundation for AI. AI is really important. It's really relevant, but only when the data foundations are solid and when firms actually trust the outputs. And it's back to that word of trust again. We talked earlier about the trusted version of the truth, and that's even more important when it comes to AI. If people are looking to plug AI into their data to run their business, then they really have to trust that data, and that trusted layer is really what Katchr's going to be providing.
It I see that you can't avoid AI anywhere in legal at all these days, and yet there seem to be so few real uses for it that are pervading the industry. There are pockets of it. So this does sound like something that, everybody can get behind and actually take advantage of and see some massive gains in productivity for both analysts and the business. So it's good of you to share that. Thank you. I know the product's tiered between the sort of express and enterprise versions. Just if you could, is share what the differences are.
Yeah, so we've had an Express product for a few years now. It was an evolution from our original solution, and the idea there was a really quick and easy first start into the Katchr world, primarily aimed at smaller law firms. So where there's much less complexity, and with our Express product, we don't provide the same level of tailoring. There's a number of predefined metrics that are available out of the box. There's some tailoring that can be done with those, but it's fairly limited. And we found this is a solution that works really well for smaller law firms who just want to get something up and running really quickly. We can be up and running in a matter of a few weeks with the Express solution. The majority of our work still is on the enterprise product. That's where the highest level of value comes from having all of that tailoring. But we have found firms who start with the Express product and are then keen to move forward to enterprise once they've got embedded with that. So it's an option.
And so that's a sort of a natural transition for them as they kind of bed in. They can move naturally to enterprise if they want.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fantastic. There's so much there in terms of what you've covered this afternoon. I'm just a bit giddy actually about the thought of all this stuff now, because it would be wonderful to see somebody actually taking advantage of this and saying, that's a decision I made based on what I saw. I can think of very few things more gratifying. So I'm really pleased you were able to share that with me this afternoon. Where can people go for more information from you?
Yeah, so if they try out our website, katchr.com, lots of information on there. If you want to follow us on LinkedIn, Katchr on LinkedIn, there is only one Katchr, I believe. Or they can track me down if you want to connect to me on LinkedIn, Graham Moore of Katchr, and more than happy to connect people and provide more information.
Brilliant. I'll embed some of those links somewhere on this screen, depending on how it pans out where I do it. But okay, really appreciate your time this afternoon, Graham. It's been great talking to you. I'm pleased you were able to share so much information about Katchr. It's been good to hear. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it.
Brilliant. Glad to hear that. As for you, the viewers, as ever, I'm grateful for your time. I'll be back with a video again, hopefully in a couple of weeks, talking some more about legal technology. And my thanks again to Graham for him sharing so much information with us this afternoon. I look forward to seeing you, the viewers, though, sometime soon. Thank you so much for watching.